All right, y'all, welcome to the Scott Horton Show. I am the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, author of the book Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and I've recorded more than 5,000 interviews going back to 2003, all of which are available at scotthorton.org. You can also sign up for the podcast feed. The full archive is also available at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show. All right, you guys, introducing Matthew Hoh. I'm sure you remember that back in 2009, he was a State Department official in Afghanistan who publicly resigned and went to the media and told Barack Obama not to launch the surge because it could not work. And, of course, he was vindicated after being ignored. And we have a lot of important Afghanistan stuff to discuss. So welcome back to the show. Matt, how are you, sir?
Good, Scott. How are you?
I'm doing real good. Appreciate you joining us on the show again here. And you know what? I'm happy to share a press release with you this morning. The Institute for Public Accuracy is advertising interviews with you or me about the subject we're about to discuss here. But I figured I better go ahead and interview you about it first and see if I got it right. I meant to mention you're from the Center for International Policy there. Oh, and I also meant to mention that you were in the Marine Corps, captain, correct? In the Marine Corps in Iraq War II before you were in Afghanistan, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. Anyway, so what it's all about is it's about the New York Times. And the New York Times has a piece from 3 days ago, by Charlie Savage, Eric Schmidt, and Michael Schwartz. I guess from the 26th. And it's called Russia Secretly Offered Afghan Militants Bounties to Kill Troops, U.S. Intelligence Says. And then they actually had a follow-up a couple of days ago. Yesterday, I guess, early yesterday, they had a follow-up. Spies and commandos warned months ago of Russian bounties on U.S. troops. And then also, I should mention, there is the Wall Street Journal version, which includes the byline of Warren P. Strobel, sadly. Russian spy unit paid Taliban to attack Americans, U.S. intelligence says. And then the Washington Post. Russian operation targeted coalition troops in Afghanistan. Intelligence finds. And so, what a big deal. Of course, the Democrats are seizing on this. Trump's refusal to do anything about it is proof of his allegiance to Russia again, and all of these kinds of things. And so I would like to know everything that you think about all of this, sir.
Well, first off, if any of those news outlets, and it goes beyond them, I mean, it's basically all major American media seemingly talking about it, NPR, CNN, et cetera. If they, in their headlines, put, unverified : Russia paid for bounty on American troops or whatever, then we wouldn't really need to be having this conversation, because the issue right off the top of this, right, is this idea of the media putting forth unsubstantiated, evidence-free reports from anonymous officials that have not been verified in any way. But the way the media puts it forward is they put it in, they headline it, and then at least the first several paragraphs of their stories use affirmative language. Russian intelligence paid, right? They don't say it's suggested that Russian intelligence paid, or it has been spoken about that maybe they paid. So just right off the bat, it's just a journalistic malpractice. And this is clickbait. This is nothing new. Most of the folks listening will surely understand that this goes back past the modern era. This is the whole remember the Maine in the Spanish-American War, the lies that led to the Mexican-American War, all the lies that existed for centuries that allowed for the genocide of Native Americans. This is the way American warfare is prefaced. It's the way it comes about, and it's what sustains American warfare are these lies. And then, of course, everyone is familiar with the lies for Iraq War II. Not so much familiar, maybe so, with the lies from the first Iraq War, with the lies about babies being ripped out of incinerators, ripped out of incubators, by Saddam's troops in Kuwait, those kinds of lies. But then, of course, the lies about Libya, the lies about Syria, the lies about Yemen, the lies that have allowed the wars to escalate all throughout Africa. Most egregious or absurd about all this is the fact that 6 months ago, the Washington Post and all these other outlets reported on it as well, wrote this story about what's called the Afghan Papers, where 400 or so American officials in writing basically summarize it. Those 400 officials in what's called after action reports or lessons learned reports basically admitted to a systematic lying by the U.S. government for the last 20 years or so about Afghanistan. So, here we are with all this historical record of journalistic malpractice, all this evidence about U.S. government lying about war. And then, we can get into it as well about how a report like this reaches Washington, D.C. about the Russians are paying for, bounties on American soldiers. But it's just it's upsetting and it's infuriating that here we are talking about this again. But it certainly is something that's always going to be the case, because this is how it's always been. These lies have always been used to start wars. They've always been used to keep wars going. They've always been used to keep tensions going. They've always been used to make sure that budgets are kept high, right? So, and then, the next part about this as well is that all those who are commenting in, on CNN, or who are at NPR talking about it, or who are, cited in the Wall Street Journal report, et cetera, they're either retired generals who are on the board of defense companies, so making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year for being on these boards, as well as having the interest of those defense companies to promote, or they are think tank experts from think tanks that are funded by the U.S. government, whether it be the State Department or the Pentagon or the CIA, or those think tanks are funded by the defense industry. So the whole the whole absurdity of it, that this is taken as a factual story, is just belied by any basic understanding of past history in Afghanistan, American history when it comes to war, or the journalistic lack of integrity when it comes to speaking about American military involvement overseas by the major American corporate media.
Yeah. It is funny how after everything, we're just supposed to pretend that whatever they say goes without saying. You have to believe it. That's the narrative of the day. And we all agree. And just, okay. And it's not, there's varying degrees of dissension on any given day, but it seems like essentially the narrative of the day wins, however they pronounce it. Certainly when it comes to demonizing Russia, my goodness. But, I wanted to point out, too, and you mentioned this at the beginning, but these three articles, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post, are uniquely weak articles. They're not just based on anonymous sources. They have no description whatsoever of what the intelligence is. Just somebody told us that. They won't name the agency where their anonymous sources work. It's just intelligence officials or just people familiar, which means that's, pretty broad. And they admit that, they don't pretend to say, we think that these boys killed in these Green Berets out in Nangarhar province fighting Islamic State guys, so-called Islamic Khorasan province guys, then we think it was that. Or it was these Marines got sniped down in the helmet or anything like that. They don't even pretend to have a causal anything here. But they all just went with it anyway. And then as Caitlin Johnstone pointed out on her website, that they all, the reporters here, two of whom I somewhat respect because, it's slim pickings and you do what you got to do. But Warren Strobel and Charlie Savage both have done really important work in the past. Some of these other guys I could do without. But
Eric Schmidt and
Eric Schmidt, forget him, man. Yeah. But to have these men all citing each other,
Savage have.
Yeah, they're all citing each other on Twitter saying, my story is confirmed by the other guy. Now my story is confirmed by him. We're all confirming each other's story. But what are they confirming? All they're confirming is that somebody said something. They're not confirming that it's true. They're confirming that this is what an intelligence report says. But they're not confirming anything in the intelligence report at all. They're not even pretending to. And they apparently can't seem to even differentiate between that. I know me and another reporter both got told by Douglas Feith that Saddam Hussein was going to nuke me and my jammies in the middle of the night. It's confirmed.
That's right. Yep. And it's just not those three. I mean, I saw NBC News was in capital letters, confirmed. We confirm this story, and same thing, too. They're just confirming that anonymous officials said this. I had a conversation earlier today with John Kiriakou. And if folks aren't familiar with John Kiriakou, please, when you're done listening to Scott and I, go through Scott's archives and listen to some of Scott's conversations with John. And John, of course, was a CIA officer, the only person to have gone to jail for U.S. torture program. Of course, John went to jail because of the torture program because he spoke about it and confirmed it as opposed to actually taking part in it. But John, John was saying how much he was struck by, once again, the language that is used, words like suggest, in the U.S. intelligence community, there's very specific language to denote degrees of certainty. So, and there is basically a glossary that you follow when you are writing an intelligence report, or that you learn when you're in intelligence school or whatever, to make sure that you are using the correct terminology to let your audience know, the people who are consuming that intelligence, to let them know the degree to which they can trust the intelligence. Look, do we have, there are certain words, if you've got somebody on camera, on video, that then there are certain words to say, yes, if all you have is like you heard someone overheard something in a restaurant, then there are other words to describe how, it's probably not credible. And so John was, we were talking about this, but the language of it. But one of the things I wanted to, speak about was just letting people understand how a report like this, and given the benefit of the doubt that a report actually exists, and I do believe that there was probably some report made that suggested this, no confirmation of it, whether or not it's credible or not. But what happens is that all throughout in both the military and the intelligence community, there's what's called commander's critical information requirements, and it could be from your direct boss all the way up to senior levels in Washington, D.C., and everyone in between, of what basically their critical information requirements are, right? So this is what your boss or your boss's boss or your boss's boss's boss wants information about, deems is the most important. And adversaries, Russia, Iran, China, et cetera, particularly when you get to the political sides of this stuff, are very heavily weighted in these information requirements. So now getting back to Afghanistan, because supposedly, at least the Times story said that this came about because of interrogation. Well, the Afghan security forces universally torture. And we all know that torture produces either two things. It basically produces the intelligence that you want from the torture victim, whether or not that person actually believes what he's saying, that he'll say whatever you want him to stop the torture. That's the reality of torture. And so what you get is you probably had somebody who was detained, some prisoner of war, or maybe even a criminal, as it's been suggested in the news stories. And this person mentions Russia. The word Russia goes into the report. And because that is a critical information requirement, plus the political aspect of it, with everything being, Russia, Russia, Russia for the last, good gosh, 6 or 7 years in the American military and intelligence communities. This Russia hysteria came into the American military and intelligence communities well before Trump took office. So that this unsubstantiated, unverified report, probably brought about by torture, makes its way up because Russia is important. And there are people, a good guy to have on to talk about this besides John Scott would be like Ray McGovern, to talk about how politicized, intelligence is, how people are looking to please the boss. So they're going to push forward things, whether or not they're substantiated or not, because that's going to please the boss. And so that's how you can understand how something like this could reach Washington, D.C. Now, whether or not it also could be totally fabricated for all I know, but just giving an idea to people of where this all comes from, how stuff like this gets, as well then to the manipulation of your reports, the manipulation of things sent forward. I could give you a story, it's a long story, but I'll give you the very briefest bit I can about a report I wrote about this program in Afghanistan we had to set up these radio towers, right? And all throughout rural Afghanistan. And then the radio towers were, and this was like $15 million, $20 million program that some company in the United States got to do, sweetheart deal, typical corrupt reconstruction project kind of thing. And they're supposed to go around and put these radio towers all throughout rural Afghanistan. And my report on it after they were done was that was a colossal failure. There wasn't diesel fuel to run the radio antennas. We didn't have program to put on the radio antennas. Rural Afghans don't own radios. Like all kinds of stuff. The thing was a failure. And what was the final thing from my report that actually got sent to Washington, D.C.? The only thing that got sent out of it was that the radio tower program installation was successful. All the other parts about it, about how it was a failure, right, all the way up and down, were left out. But the fact that the radio antennas actually got installed, that made it to D.C. So as far as the people in D.C. know, oh, hey, and that's just one story out of millions of stories that are out there about how reporting works in the American military, in the intelligence community, in the diplomatic community, about how good news is shared or politicized news is shared. Right. So it really is, this is not a surprise that something like this is coming out. A few years ago, as many people will recall, there was these reports about Russia providing weapons to the Taliban. Now, first of all, the only confirmed weapons transfer between Russia and Afghanistan was in 2016 when Russia gave 10,000 weapons to the Afghan military. Right.
And when America got the Indians to buy Russian helicopters for the Kabul government because America has sanctions on Russia and can't buy them directly.
Yeah, right. There's all kinds of stuff about, but CNN and others take this story about Russian. They show a clip of like a Taliban fighter holding an AK-47. Never mind that about 15 or 20 countries at least manufacture AK-47s in the world. The United States military and CIA purchase those weapons and give them to insurgent groups and government groups all around the world. Never mind all that. We're going to show one Taliban fighter holding a Russian-style Kalashnikov-style rifle, and that's going to be proof that the Russians. That's meanwhile, top U.S. defense officials, intelligence officials, the Secretary General of NATO, the Afghan government itself all said, we don't have any information to corroborate. We have no evidence about Russia giving us weapons. It's just rumors. But, that stuff, even with all that, you go back to this Wall Street Journal story from the other day about and Strobel and I forget who the other person on that byline was. But, at the end, they bring up how Russia gave weapons to the Taliban. And it's not true. They didn't give weapons. There's no evidence of that. And we have, you have a list of American, NATO, and Afghan officials as long as my arm saying we have no evidence of this. But the journal still goes, and other places still go and repeat this false story from 2017. So they're not only do they continue to put forward new rumors, new speculation, new anonymous reports, with no substantiation behind them. They keep recycling older ones.
Yep.
And again, one of the things I just found curious today as I was going through some of the stuff I review, daily or weekly in terms of military-related stuff, was, you look at the investments the U.S. military is making in hypersonic missiles and all that nonsense, all that stuff that'll never work, right? If people haven't heard Scott's interview with Andrew Coburn about hypersonic missiles, go and listen to that one after you listen to the ones about John Kiriakou and everything. But so it is. There is this. There are multiple constituencies that benefit from increasing tensions with Russia. One, of course, it's clickbait from the media. Two, the media is, well,
in the original source, the Afghan government has quite an interest in figuring out a way to get America to stay.
That's exactly right. As well as, too, the defense industry wants to sell next generation tanks and next generation helicopters and next generation missile systems and next generation. Hey, our next generation of aircraft carriers are going to be $15 billion a piece. Right. I mean,
sweet.
So right. I think our next generation submarines are $10 billion a piece or something like that. Right. So, I mean, you don't use those. You use those against
but what
the
about
Russians
Russia,
and the Chinese.
Man? What about Russia's interest? Is there any credible reason at all that you could think of why the Russians would want to hire jihadis of whatever description? Jesus Christ, I can't talk. Any reason that you could think of why the Russians would want to pay whoever to kill Americans in Afghanistan as we're seemingly on our way out, which, by the way, Trump has ordered another withdrawal of 4,000 men, bringing us down to 4,000, which is 4,000 lower than when he took office after he escalated it up to 15,000, of course. But that he has signed a deal with the Taliban to have us out of there 1 year from now. By the end of May, it's the end of June now, but the end of May next year. And so maybe the Russians are just kicking us in the ass on the way out for fun, a little bit of revenge, something, anything. Nancy Pelosi said they are still not over our humiliation of them in Afghanistan back in the 80s.
It makes you could understand how there might be some old timers within the Russian military and intelligence community that will want to get revenge, but there's no way that type of thinking would percolate up to the level where a decision like this would be made. And it's interesting, in one of the news stories, it said how the decision was made without Vladimir Putin being involved. I forget which story that was, which I found really, really discredits the whole story, because I can't imagine any intelligence or military organization in the world will conduct such an operation as this, putting the bounties putting bounties on your adversaries' heads like this. How could anyone make a decision like that without the top man, saying do this?
It also goes to show that
I don't know how clandestine operation authority works in Russia, but I can't imagine that Putin would allow things like this to occur without his. And so, what benefit is it for the Russians? I don't see that benefit. One, why? It just makes no sense to me. They are not, the Russians are not, there's no benefit to the Russians allying themselves with the, extremist Islamist Taliban, right? Because of Russia's issues with Islamic extremism and Islamic terrorism and the problems they've had whether it being former Soviet republics or in Russia itself over the last 20, 30 years. There's just, it just doesn't, you can say, well, the Taliban are the enemy of my enemy, so therefore my friend. But still, none of this really makes sense when you really stop and think about it and kind of play out all the second and third order effects of it. Yeah. Then Russia has so many problems itself. Its economy has been doing, various issues within Russia don't lead me to believe that the Russian government, Vladimir Putin, wants to escalate tensions to a level where this type of action would lead. Now, certainly you could claim the Russians are doing other things. They're flying their jets too close to our jets, like et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, that's but putting bounties on another force's soldiers brings it, if it was exposed, would bring it to tensions to such a level that you can understand the risks would completely mitigate doing such an operation. Now, there's people out there who will say, well, hey, the United States Air Force and the United States Navy killed a lot of Russian mercenaries in Syria. This is their way of getting back. I just don't, again, the risks for the Russians to do something like this far outweigh any benefits that I believe could come from it. And then all the other evidence about, well, American commandos found money in Afghanistan is so awash with money, most of it coming from our CIA or our military, but also too from all that, $120 billion we've spent on reconstruction work over there, which didn't build anything, as well as too, most of the funding for the Taliban comes from the Saudis and the other Gulf monarchies.
And from the U.S.
And then, of course, from the Pakistanis and from the U.S.
Yeah, I mean we pay them protection money, still.
This is the whole, it's just that Russia is the enemy in the best interests of the American military-industrial complex. And it comes simply to that, and that's how this should be viewed in terms of understanding the genesis of it, why American media hops onto it, and this is another thing we could talk about some other day, but basically understanding that the same banks that own the majority shares in all the American media companies, right, Scott? You know this, and most of your listenership knows this, right? The same banks and money management firms that own all these shares that are majority shareholders in the six corporations that own 90% of American media. They're also the majority shareholders in the defense industry. Right. So it all comes back to who owns these corporations. And it should not be a surprise then that the establishment media is in favor of the establishment wars. And then we see, as you said, Nancy Pelosi, but also Liz Cheney and Lindsey Graham on the other side jumping on this and demanding action. We have to take action. Yeah. So you can understand who benefits from a report like this. And there are more in the United States who benefit from these tensions than I believe benefit in Russia from these tensions. It just doesn't make sense to me why the Russians would do something like this, because the risks for it are way too great for the benefits of what? Killing a handful of – we've had 4 guys killed in 2020, 20 guys killed in 2019 in Afghanistan, and that was the most in 6 or 7 years. Right. So, they're going to the Russians are going to do an operation like this to kill 1, 2, 3, 4 American soldiers. It just makes no sense to me. Meanwhile, though, as we said, the beneficiaries of this in the United States are legion, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems like if it was a fact that they were doing it, then the most obvious or simplest explanation would be They're trying to give us an excuse to stay. They're trying to undermine Trump's, because they know Trump is all alone and trying to get us out of there. And the status quo otherwise would reign there. And so if that's true, then what does that say about our war there, that the Russians would like to see it continue? One, because they've supported our war there for the Tajik side all along anyway, because we're the ones who switched side in the war, not them, right? But then also, you see the same, William Casey, bin Ladenite plan to bleed Russia to bankruptcy is the same kind of thing that they must be enjoying. You mentioned how the Americans have been, the conflicts in Syria where Russians have been killed, where the Americans have stated openly. James Jeffries just said, pointed out to me that just in April, he talked about, we're giving the Russians a quagmire in Syria. And they're that blatant about it. So it just seems to me like, even if it's true, then it just proves that we should go. And what are these people? And think of the logic of this. Say there's some flying Russian sniper going around killing our guys. That's why we have to keep sending guys to get sniped by this guy when we already lost the war 10 years ago? And this whole thing is crazy. We're leaving anyway. How do you ask the man to be the last one to die for that?
That as John Kerry famously said, right?
Yeah.
Again,
that's accepting the hypothetical of the argument,
Yeah, the narrative behind this, the story behind this, is that this is meant to make the United States leave. But the reality is that if you believe it, Donald Trump canceled the whole summit with the Taliban and the Afghan government in Camp David last September because an American soldier was killed by the Taliban, and that pushed back the signing of the peace deal between the U.S. and the Taliban by 6 or 7 months. Yep. So if that is the case, that they did this, the Russians did this to get the Americans to leave, well, the evidence is that Americans are going to stay. But then on the other side of it, are they doing it to keep the Americans in, to bleed them? We're not spending that much money on Afghanistan relative to other things, right? I mean, in a sense of that, the $1 trillion,
tens of billions a year still, at least,
It's still tens of billions. Exactly. Probably, exactly. 20 to $30 billion a year, probably, maybe $40 billion a year, probably. But when you put that next to the $1.2 or $1.3 trillion spent overall on the American war machine every year, that's relatively chump change. It's much better to get the Americans to invest in these hypersonic missiles that won't work and spend, the new generation of Star Wars or whatever they want us. That's never going to work.
The next Al-Qaeda attack will be a false flag. They try to make it look like China was behind it so we can build some more battleships.
What's interesting is say that about China, because I remember a friend of mine about 10 years ago, so about 2010 or so, said to me he had just had a conversation in China with a Chinese diplomat or Chinese official, and he said something about like off the record, what is kind of like China's ultimate plan for U.S. foreign policy, and China said, do everything we can to keep the Americans stuck in places like Afghanistan, because they saw the folly of it, right? I mean, you're spending at that point in 2010, U.S. Congress was appropriating like $120 billion a year for Afghanistan. Right. We were losing, several hundred young men and women every year, let alone in casualties, let alone just the drain on attention and resources and everything else. Yeah, as well as just the pure folly of it. You want to see your adversary stuck in quicksand. That's something that if you're the Russia or China or whoever, just look at the U.S. and all these wars.
Right. Well, and of course that means that if you and I are ever successful at getting people to listen to us about why to get out of the Middle East, then we'll be helping to free up resources to pivot to Asia and make things worse there. Yeah. I don't mean to say the Taliban are a worthy sacrifice, but man, if this war has kept us out of that one all this time, I don't know.
Well, I mean, if I was a consultant working for the Pentagon, or the CIA, or the defense industry, or whatever, yeah, I think this is a brilliant thing to do. Like, okay, let's do this story about Russia putting bounties on our soldiers' head in Afghanistan. Because if I'm part of like the big Pentagon, if I'm part of like the Pentagon that buys tanks and ships and fighter planes, I don't want anything to do with Afghanistan. There's very few elements within the U.S. military and intelligence apparatus that really want to be in Afghanistan. You've got the special operations guys, you've got the CIA paramilitary guys, you've got some leftover counterinsurgency types, but for the most part, like they want to be fighting they want to be fighting the Russians in the Fulda Gap, right? Or they want to be fighting the Chinese in fighter plane duels over the South China Sea. So, yeah, let's put together this story about the Russians paying for bounties on our soldiers' heads in Afghanistan. That makes the Russians seem worse, which means we need to buy more tanks, next generation tanks. We need to buy more aircraft carriers. We need to buy more F-35s. We need to buy that next generation bomber plane, which is going to cost $2 billion a plane or whatever. Something I read today, the Zumwalt class destroyer, of which there are supposed to have been like 40 produced, of which we're only going to make 3, but we're bound to make 3. They're still going to make 3. That thing has like this advanced gun on it, right? Each of the shells for that gun cost $500,000 for each shell, right? I mean, so that's what you want to do. You want to sell that stuff. And so let's get out of Afghanistan. If you're logical, you're reasoned, and say this story is true, right? Scott, say this is true. Say the Russians did put bounties on it. Anyone who's logical or reasonable will just be like, well, hell, this is another reason to get out of Afghanistan, right? I mean, really? There's any more of if you need another suggestion, here's one more. Another nation is putting bounties on our troops' head. Let's get out of that place. It's not doing anything for any of us, Yeah. So, but then that makes Russia look like a villain, which, of course, gives you all the reason, right, to spend all this money on all the next generation weapons that are, each of those programs are tens and tens of billions of dollars each. And that's really the gravy train that, the defense industry wants. And, these are the new tanks and the new planes and the new ships that, Navy captains and Army and Air Force colonels want. Yeah, that kind of stuff. So, but no, this whole thing is very insidious. It's it makes me sick to my stomach. I'm sure it does you. I'm sure it makes everyone else who's listening sick to their stomachs as well. But it's the reality. It's part of the playbook that we're up against. And so we have to keep speaking against it.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thanks for coming on to do so. Appreciate that.
All right. Thanks, man. And you be well and stay healthy and safe. And same with everyone else there. Please stay healthy and safe, everyone.
Right on. Hey, thanks very much again, Matt. Appreciate it.
Okay, you bet.
All right, you guys. That is the great Matthew Hoh. He tried to stop the Afghan surge. All you had to do was listen to him. There's everything you needed right there to say, yeah, no, don't. The Scott Horton Show, Anti-War Radio, can be heard on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA, APSradio.com, antiwar.com, scotthorton.org, and libertarianinstitute.org.